Hello, ladies. I'm assuming, by the way, because of the title of this video, I'm assuming that this is more going to be like a girl party. But hey, if you're a dude and you want to learn about estrogen, you know, we don't discriminate here at the IBS Freedom Podcast. And technically, you have some estrogen too. It's just that the likelihood of being estrogen dominant is slim to none. But anyway, Amy, what are we talking about with the girls today?
Yeah, we're talking about estrogen dominance. Whoa.
EDOM.
EDOM. Yes.
So estrogen is bad, and we should just get rid of it, and then we're done with all of these problems, right?
Right.
Short episode.
Woohoo!
No, we are blessed and cursed with hormones that fluctuate wildly, and we get the gift of fertility and the curse of the period, and it is what it is, ladies. But
right.
What I will start us off by saying is that I think this topic might even be a little bit overdue. This is episode 182 of this fine podcast, and we have yet to touch on this. In my mind, it's because hormones are pretty downstream to everything else. Like if you get your nutrition, your sleep, your stress, your movement, the unsexy basic foundational stuff, if you get all of that dialed in, most people don't have to worry about hormones because they're just responding to everything else around you. But I will say there's some pretty compelling evidence that estrogen or estrogen receptors are involved in the symptomology of IBS. So this could certainly be relevant for conversations around like bloating and motility and visceral hypersensitivity and even like mast cell kind of histamine stuff, which we know is a thing in this world. So I do think that it's a worthwhile conversation to have. It just wasn't super front of mind for us because we're so focused on getting to the root of the root of the root. Would you agree, Amy?
Yeah, 100%. I have like an interesting story too, and it's more of estrogen like depletion being an issue for this particular person, but just an idea of how sex hormones or lack thereof or too much of certain sex hormones can really affect digestion and symptomology. I have a client currently who I think for a couple years, if I remember right, was doing all the traditional SIBO stuff. She was having all these GI issues, bloating, all this stuff. And like some might have helped a little bit, but nothing really crazy. So she, at some point got diagnosed with, I'm going to butcher it, like ovarian insufficiency or primary ovarian insufficiency. So like all her hormones are low, and she's had kind of issues long term. So this hasn't been a new thing. But then they started supplementing hormones with her. And it is really fascinating because she said 80% of her gut symptoms just went away upon addressing the hormones, which is so fascinating. And I think a good example of if you get so narrowed in on one thing or, the microbiome versus zooming out sometimes and seeing the whole picture, you can miss like some of these key things that could certainly affect function in major ways. But yeah, she's like a really interesting example of going down all the rabbit holes for the microbiome stuff and then being like, well, let me just see what this does. And the intervention seemed to help with pretty much all of her gut symptoms.
You know what it makes me think of actually is our boy Hippocrates, right? Like that Hippocrates quote that everybody in our world likes to quote, that all disease begins in the gut. And it's like, I get what you meant, Hippocrates. Like, I appreciate that you had a gut forward kind of worldview, apparently, but also that's simply not true. Not all disease begins in the gut. And there are going to be cases where symptoms respond really positively to, thyroid hormone or sex hormone management, detoxification, something that's kind of outside the gut or more like allergic, inflammatory sort of stuff. So there are definitely cases where this is appropriate. And I would say if anybody is a non-believer, I feel like women generally understand how important hormones are because we're on this roller coaster every day. Right. But just for funsies, I'll say, if anybody is a skeptic that hormones are important to your health or that they affect your body tremendously, just talk to somebody who has been through menopause.
Right.
They will tell you pretty quickly that hormones are really freaking important and they do a lot of stuff. And, maybe one lens to see hormones through is not even gut related directly, although there is research for that. But think about it this way. Your brain is built to run with certain hormonal chemistry assumptions in mind, right? So like the male brain is really built to run on more testosterone, and like the neurotransmitters and the connections and the activity of the brain is very much accustomed to levels of testosterone, versus women's brains and our chemistry and our synapses are much more wired to favor female hormone chemistry. And that includes estrogen. And again, like you hear these stories of women who go through menopause and they feel like shit, and then they get some hormone replacement and their brain works again.
Right.
And they're able to sleep. They're not a raving psycho bitch to their family members anymore. They're able to like function and they don't have brain fog. So if you think about it indirectly, if hormones impact the brain that profoundly, they sure as hell are going to affect the vagus nerve, which then is going to affect your ability to make stomach acid, make bile, make enzymes, run motility, control your immune system in and around the gut, control the liver, like all of the stuff from like your neck down that's controlled by the vagus nerve could be impacted by hormone activity. Again, whether it be too low or too high is up for grabs. But I think, when we talked about this topic for this episode, we talked about estrogen dominance because I think that that's probably a bit more common than the outright hormone deficiency. But also that is something that does have some research as far as like IBS, visceral hypersensitivity, motility, mast cells. And what I want to start us off with for the estrogen dominance discussion is I think twofold. A is that the idea is that you have too much estrogen and your body is like overburdened with this particular hormone. So you're getting a lot of estrogenic activity in your body and it's not being matched with progesterone, because normally it's kind of like a yin-yang situation. Right. So for some women, the answer is to try to get the estrogen to come back down a bit because they have an excess. For some women, the answer might be trying to raise progesterone so that they have the progesterone to combat the deleterious effects of estrogen. So, there's a little bit of nuance to this conversation. It's not like every supplement is going to work for every estrogen dominant case. But before we get into that a bit, can
I talk a little bit to build off what you were saying there, and how the hormones interact? Like, it reminds me too how probably cortisol plays into this. Just because cortisol and progesterone they have some of the same precursors. So again, I think a lot of people where there is like a high degree of stress can start to have that imbalance building. And maybe again, like you said, the estrogen isn't inherently high, but the progesterone starts to dip and you get that estrogen dominant profile and the symptoms and things like that. So I think again, like it is interesting how the sex hormones interact with the other hormones. And it's interesting because we'll talk about different interventions for estrogen dominance, but some of them to me like seem to target the HPA axis and they're like adaptogenic in nature. And so it's interesting that those seem to have sex hormone benefits and cortisol balancing benefits. But yeah, I think it's interesting how the hormones interact and could be interactions with other hormones could be affecting the balance too.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up a point too, and this is going to turn into a really tangled web. So I think the one thing to know about hormones is that all hormones interact with and talk to all the other hormones. So it like pick two hormones and they chat with each other, right? It could be insulin and cortisol. It could be cortisol and estrogen. It could be testosterone and progesterone. Like it doesn't matter. They all talk to each other and interact. But you bring up an interesting point, harkening back to one of our beloved unsexy basics that we talk about so much, right? Is that if you're super stressed and you have a lot of cortisol floating around, not only is that going to directly affect your sex hormones, but also it's going to jack up your HPA axis. And maybe now you're not getting the signaling, like the FSH, LH signaling to tell your ovaries when to make the hormones or in what quantity to make them. But also stress chemistry is one of the most potent degranulators of mast cells.
Right.
And histamine and estrogen are BFFs forever. Higher estrogen begets higher histamine and vice versa. So, it's like whether you want to think about stress chemistry being bad for the hormones themselves or the histamine and then the hormones or the gut-brain axis and then the gut, like it's all connected in this web of stuff.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, the histamine piece I think is interesting, especially considering how sometimes estrogen dominance and some histamine symptoms coexist at different parts of their cycle. It's something I'm sure you see at times where a woman says, whoa, I feel like terrible when I ovulate. And then I feel kind of terrible again right before my cycle starts. Like, what's going on there? And it's like these fluctuations in estrogen seem to drive maybe their histamine levels already a little bit too high, and then it's like the bucket's overflowing, so to speak, at different phases of their cycle when estrogen's higher. Again, I see that fairly commonly at times. It's not like with every woman at all, but some people that have more cyclical symptoms, I wonder a lot about the histamine component with the estrogen link, like you're saying.
Yeah. And I want to make this point early on in the episode, I think, too, is that a lot of times I think you can observe a hormone pattern with symptoms, but that doesn't mean that the hormones are the problem, right? Universally.
The hormones are typically like the symptom. A lot of the hormonal changes. Now, again, there can be things that are not like that. Again, I think of like autoimmune thyroid issues too. Like, okay, well, no, it's not. There's a pathology that's happening that's leading to maybe low dysregulated thyroid levels. But I think if the body doesn't have like an outright disease, a lot of times hormones are just kind of signals that they're reading the cues of the body and shifting accordingly.
Well, there's that element. And also, I would make the claim that hormones, I think, change your threshold in a lot of ways. Yeah. So like at different points in your cycle, your threshold for bloating might be really low. And so you get bloated all the time. Like everything you eat, you're just bloated all the time because it's like that threshold or that reserve is really low. And then other points in your cycle where you have some more natural resiliency built in, maybe your threshold is really high and like you can eat gluten and it doesn't bloat you. So, but again, what sometimes will happen is a woman will notice that there is a hormone-dependent pattern to her symptoms, right? Like, oh, I get really, really bloated around ovulation and I get really, really bloated right before my period. And oftentimes the kind of mindset that happens is, oh, so therefore it's a hormone problem. It's like, no, it could still be something else and you're just raising and lowering that threshold and it's not really a hormone problem per se. Right. There's a difference between saying that something is related to your hormones or that the pattern is tangled up with hormones versus hormones are the problem. Those are two different things. So I would just kind of caution us in this way as we get into this conversation. But, maybe starting with the symptom profile, like what sort of symptoms might suggest that a woman is more estrogen dominant, Amy?
Yeah, I think, some of the symptoms might overlay with general PMS type symptoms. So more moodiness and irritability and kind of mood swingy type things. I would say it's a big one. Breast tenderness is one that I see frequently. Sometimes heavier cycles can be an indication. I think some of the other ones can be a little bit vaguer, but like headaches can sometimes, fatigue, cramping, like PMS-y type symptoms I think are sometimes overlay. Now I think that doesn't always indicate estrogen dominance. And I think that to make this clear, I think it's probably normal to have a little bit of symptoms with your cycle too. So I don't want people to think like, oh, I have a bit of cramping. Is that estrogen dominance or something like that? I think it's usually kind of more extreme and debilitating when people have the higher degree of estrogen dominance. Because again, I think you might feel differently at different phases of your cycle, and that's okay. It's more if it's disruptive to your day with some of these symptoms.
And frankly, periods are weird. Like you are shedding bloody pulp out of your vagina. It's understandable that you're not going to feel in tip-top shape when you're gearing up for that. It's a weird thing that we do. So to, I think your point, if you have some degree of symptomology around your period, it's not to say, oh my God, you have estrogen dominance, but you're right. I think what usually tips me off is like the more extreme forms of PMS, the versions of like, wow, I really can't function at all, really heavy bleeding, like going through a super jumbo tampon every hour on the hour, or needing to wear like a Depends or a really heavy pad or something.
Yeah.
Breast tenderness is a pretty good giveaway also. I think more profound breast tenderness around your cycle could be a good giveaway. So yeah, I think more profound PMS is a good indicator. Mm-hmm. I would also say too, you could do some testing for this sort of stuff, and that's reasonable enough, I suppose. But sometimes you could just try treating empirically for like a cycle or two and see if you feel better. The trick with dealing with female hormones is that since they oscillate on a month-to-month basis, you really can't judge any intervention prior to like the 3-month mark. So what that means is if you're starting a new supplement or a new herb or a new whatever for your hormones, you basically have to give it 3 full cycles before you can judge it accurately.
For sure. I know that's the hard thing about hormones. It's like sometimes if you take a digestive aid or like a prokinetic, like fairly quickly you could know if it's helping. Mm-hmm. And you could either nix it or keep doing it. But yeah, I think that's the hard part with hormonal interventions. You have to be patient and just kind of wait it out.
It's hard too when you have GI-based symptoms that are coming and going. Like I have a case like this right now that I'm working with. She and I hypothesized some hormone involvement maybe 2 months ago, but we decided to hold off on testing for the time being. And she's doing pretty well in a lot of regards, but she, at our most recent appointment, said, yo, dude, it's my luteal phase. Just the moment I ovulate until the moment I get my period, it's just a nightmare. Everything is a nightmare. I can't tolerate carbs. I can't tolerate fiber, brain fog, anxiety, fatigue, like everything is bad.
Right.
So we're going to do some hormone testing and just see if we can capture any sort of pattern that's useful. But when we got talking about it, initially, a couple of months ago, I had recommended that she start on some maca, just because that Feminescence Maca Harmony product is just so good and it's so well tolerated. I figured let's just take a stab at this and see if it helps. And when we talked about the likelihood of doing some testing, she did say, I've been on the Maca Harmony and it's not helping. And I'm like, oh, okay. But then she's only been on it for a month. So I'm like, oh, well, it's kind of too early to say anything, dude. You gotta stay on it. So we're in this kind of funky holding pattern with her where we'll do some hormone testing and try to get an assessment on that. But also it could be that the thing she's already doing is going to be the answer and she just needs to do it for longer.
Right.
The gift of a lesson in patience because of our hormones, ladies. Ah, what a gift it is.
It is true, man. It's a wild ride sometimes if you're having some hormonal symptoms. Yeah. I think in terms of like how to intervene first might be a good place to start too. Like what, and I think the fundamentals, like you said, if stress is a factor, maybe working on that. Similar to gut stuff, like you still need all the foundations. So I would start there. I think nutrition's actually a really interesting lever to pull on. Now, there could be some semi-nuancy things you could try nutritionally for estrogen dominance specifically, but like eating regular or like balanced meals, getting some fruits, vegetables, like basic stuff I think is going to help the most. Now, getting fiber, we can talk about like the microbiome element because there is a connection there, but I think there's a couple nutrients that seem to help a lot with the symptomology of like PMS symptoms, which makes me think that they help estrogen dominance, and there's different things to potentially think about there. But the two that are studied a lot are B6 and magnesium. Now, magnesium could be a little bit about like having a nutrient that can help kind of relax muscles versus like being contracted and crampy. So there could be an element of that that's helpful, but there is a lot of research on magnesium helping PMS. Same thing with B6 has some good research on it. That actually could be more of like a detox booster, and it could have something to do with the histamine element too, where it helps symptoms. But there's a number of ways that I think B6 could potentially help symptomology that's consistent with estrogen dominance. And you could make sure you're getting it in dietarily at first. It's supplementing a little bit with those things just to see if it helps your cycle. Might not be a bad thing. I think they're fairly low risk as long as you're not overdoing it. Options to try. So, and just kind of assessing your diet to see where you're at with those nutrients. Magnesium, I think, could be low fairly frequently for people, like in terms of when I look at their diet. It's one that can be a little bit on the lower side. It's in the US population, one of the more common deficiencies in our diet. B6 I don't see quite as frequently, but I still think that there could be still something I would assess dietarily. But those two, again, nutrients I think are interesting. The other thing that some people could potentially think a little bit about nutritionally is like phytoestrogens in the diet. Now, like, I think if you're generally well balanced and like your gut's doing pretty good, I don't know necessarily if you have to be like super stringent about low phytoestrogens in the diet. These are things that are in like tofu. That's why like a lot of times people are like, don't eat tofu. Right, it's estrogenic. And you're like already estrogen dominant. And I think there could potentially be someone that has more estrogen dominance where I don't think it probably would be wise to eat tofu like every day. Would probably.
I actually could disagree with that.
Okay, yeah.
Mark the calendar, folks. 182,
oh
the first episode where we disagreed on something.
Yes.
Because here's the thing, is that those estrogenic compounds in foods like soy, they are selective estrogen receptor modulators, which means that they have kind of a quasi-adaptogenic effect in a sense of, at least based on what I've seen, if your estrogen activity is too high, and then you have some of these like soy compounds, for example, it will lower the activity of the estrogen. Like it binds to the receptor, but it's weakly bound. So you're not getting the same amount of estrogenic activity as if the hormone bound to it. So it's like blocking the receptor. But anyway, so if your estrogen activity is too high, it brings you back down. But also if you're estrogen deficient, having something bind to the receptor, even if it's weak, is better than nothing. So it could have a pro-estrogenic effect if you're too low. So I don't know. I feel like those phytoestrogens and soy-based, isoflavones could be really helpful for this potentially. But like anything else, you've got to feel it out and see what you think about it for you and your experience and how it makes your body feel. That's all there is to it. Right.
Well, I think, again, like, to me, the way I've kind of interpreted it, maybe I'm interpreting it wrong, but is that a lot of the phytoestrogens get kind of converted in the gut to a degree. So, like, if the gut is primarily healthy, it can do those kind of adaptogenic things. But if there's some imbalance there, you could still be kind of pulling more estrogen into the body. And that could be from all forms, not just these food-based forms. You're pulling your own estrogen back into the body. So yeah, I think, again, like it's an interesting dilemma, because I've definitely read like it can kind of block some of the receptors a little bit as well. But yeah, I think it's an interesting. And it could be kind of nuancy for the person, like everything, which is a weird thing to kind of maneuver, if that makes sense.
Well, and I'll throw this out there too. Some of it might be genetic in the sense that there is some evidence that Asian people process soy and like convert those compounds more effectively than other ethnicities. Mm-hmm. So like us as Caucasian people, we might not have the microbes or the genetics that are perfectly in line with eating a whole ton of soy or tofu or tempeh or whatever. But, you know, my best friend from grad school is of Chinese descent, and she grew up like eating Asian food, and, you know, maybe she has the microbiome and the genetics that are better suited to that. So I think there's also that kind of conversation.
Yeah, it reminds me of the keto world where they're like, have you heard Eskimos eat 90% of their diet from whale flubber? And it's like, okay.
Cool.
Well, it's like, okay, but you are like I want to say basic white. You're
a cracker.
You're a basic white from the Midwest. Like, I don't think you're built to necessarily have 90% of your diet as whale flubber. But yeah, I think that there's nuancey things to that. And I think in general, like, probably overdoing anything is not a good thing in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think for the majority of people, just working on dietary balance is going to be the most helpful from a dietary standpoint than anything else.
And I love that you brought up 2 specific nutrients, but I will say, I think if we were challenged, we could make a case for every single vitamin and mineral, probably. So like, you know, I think magnesium and zinc are both needed by COMT, which is one of the detox pathways. You need selenium to make glutathione, and you need glutathione to like run your detox. Basically, every B vitamin is needed by some detoxification enzyme somewhere in the body or the liver. So really, B6 is awesome, but you probably shouldn't be deficient in like any of the B vitamins if you want to detoxify adequately. And fiber, you know, one of the ways that detoxification is conceptualized, and it's worth noting here that you do detox your hormones. So when your body is done with the hormone, you conjugate it and detox it in the liver, and then you would dump it into urine or bile to potentially excrete it from the body. But oftentimes the way that I've seen detoxification taught, and the way I teach it, at least in FODMAP Freedom, is that you open up the detox drainage pathways first. So you want to get the person pooping adequately and like peeing and sweating and hydrating. Then you can work your way backwards and think about things like the nutrients and the herbs that can stoke the detoxification enzymes. But, you know, even something as simple as fiber. How many people come to you and pay you damn good money to fix their pooping problems, and they're not eating freaking fiber, Amy? Would you say it's like at least 80% of the people we work with?
It's true. And I will say too, like a lot of them are like, I'm doing good on fiber. And I'm like, let's just see. Maybe that's true. And that has been true before, but like, let's just see. A lot of times too, it's after I've already very subtly looked at their diet, and I'm kind of like, I think you might be a little low. And they're like, no, I think I'm good. And I'm like, I don't know. Let's look a little bit deeper under this hood.
Well, it's like that study that I mentioned, right? It's like, what is it? 62% of the American public think they're getting enough dietary fiber, but they're actually not.
Right.
5% thinks they're getting enough fiber, and they actually are. And then it's the remaining like 33% of people who know damn well they're not getting fiber, and they're correct in that assessment.
God bless those people. They're like, I'm just not getting fiber. Whatever.
What else?
Yeah, I like too that you brought it back to like every nutrient's gonna be important. It reminds me of the book work I'm doing, where it's like, oh yeah, if you like really dig into every nutrient, you're gonna find pretty much mechanisms that are gonna affect gut function in certain ways. The same thing's true with this. I think the B6 and the magnesium are the ones that I've just seen more studies specifically on these types of symptoms. But again, it'd be kind of interesting if you just pulled a random, like had people randomly supplement with zinc or something. And maybe there's studies, I just haven't seen them, but had them do zinc and see, oh, how does this affect their symptomology? It probably could lower their symptomology. But the B6 and magnesium seem like slightly more consistently researched for this area. Whether there's like a huge reason for that compared to other nutrients. But again, I like that you're bringing this back to like, no, you need total nutrition.
Like, don't keep your crappy diet and then take a magnesium and a B6 supplement and think, oh, I'm good now. And honestly, I think that there is some evidence for the argument that nutrients are better if they're acquired through food.
That's true.
Taking the B6 supplement might not do the trick. You might need to genuinely get it through your food, but that's a whole topic for another day. Maybe we need to have Sarah Ballantyne back on to talk about that one, because I know she's talked about like multivitamin research and how there's really a lack of compelling evidence that multivitamins do much of anything for us as far as like all-cause mortality and that sort of thing. But yeah, this is yet another topic where people want to get super dialed in and specific on this one kind of thing. And yet again, we're over here screaming from the rooftops that the unsexy basics matter very much. Another potential angle for different nutrients, vitamins, minerals, etc., is that you need a lot of different vitamins and minerals to process and kind of detox your histamine.
Yeah.
So again, the idea that more histamine begets more estrogen and vice versa, if you're not clearing your histamine out of your body and processing that adequately because you have a raging vitamin C deficiency or a copper deficiency and you're not making DAO, well, good luck.
Right.
Of course, you're going to have some more estrogen as a consequence of that. So really...
Oh, I was just going to say, I feel like I'm interrupting you a lot more this one. The roles have been reversed.
I'm probably also talking a little bit too much, so I'll just let you have the stage for a moment here.
You're A-okay. I was going to add to the fiber comment too. We haven't talked about, again, sometimes I get a little leery to zone so much into the microbiome just because people are already there. But there is what they call the estrobolome, which is so sexy, isn't it? The estrobolome. Ooh.
Very sexy. I mean, we are talking about hormones.
That's true.
So there's a little bit of sexiness in this conversation.
That's 100% true. But yeah, the estrobolome is sort of this microbes in the gut that can affect estrogen metabolism, essentially. So, if you have a healthy, balanced estrobolome, you're going to have more balanced estrogen levels, where sometimes the microbes are going to reactivate estrogen and pull them back into the body. And then other times the estrobolome is going to have you poop them out. Now, if there's imbalances or too much of certain microbes, you can see too much of the estrogen being pulled into the body. And then if there's too little, you can actually probably have too little estrogen being pulled in the body, which could lead to other hormonal things, maybe like PCOS-esque type things. But yeah, I think that the microbiome certainly plays a role. I don't think it's like the only role. So I see, again, people on Instagram saying, just have to correct your microbiome to correct all your hormonal issues. And it's like, no. That's not going to correct you being depleted nutritionally or stressed or...
Damn Hippocrates and your damn quote that everybody uses.
But like the microbiome is important. So getting fiber, I think, is probably a big piece to help keep the microbiome happy and healthy. And there's still some fundamental things to help create a better estrobolome that you need to be doing too, even if, again, the estrobolome is a piece of the puzzle. A lot of the fundamentals will cover that base too. But yeah, it is interesting that there is a microbiome piece of the puzzle. It's just not the whole puzzle.
No, it's not the whole puzzle. I think also keep in mind that our understanding of the microbiome is very much in its infancy.
Right.
So I know damn well there's at least one person listening to us right now, and they are already Googling estrobolome, and they're looking up which bacteria affect estrogen metabolism, and they're going to look at their GI map results, and they're trying to figure it out. And, I just want to remind people that something like 50% of the microbes in the human gut don't even have a name yet. And if we don't have a name for a particular microbe, we sure as hell don't have any research on them, and we don't know what they do and what they make and who they hang out with. So, you're going to be tempted to look at E. coli and proteobacteria and those sorts of guys. And as far as we are aware, it is proteobacteria that make that beta-glucuronidase enzyme, and that's the thing that we think is responsible for the recycling of the estrogen. And theoretically, if you have too many proteobacteria or too much E. coli, you get too much of this enzyme and then you recycle your estrogen. So like that's the going theory, but who's to say there's not another bacteria that we are going to name or identify 10 years from now, and that it's like mind blow moment, this was the one after all, and we just don't know it yet because we're just not there. So, resist the temptation to get super sexyified with the stool testing and the data collection.
Right.
I think based on what we know at this point, fiber has a couple of roles to play, because dietary fiber and even high FODMAP foods are going to lower the pH of the colon, which inhibits the bacteria that make beta-glucuronidase. So I think that has a mechanism, and also just like fiber providing a raft that you poop stuff out on is another viable mechanism. But yeah, I mean, the gut matters. We wouldn't have this podcast. We wouldn't do what we do if the gut didn't matter, but it's just not 100% of the story. And
right. Well, and I think too, like the gut matters, but to our earlier point, a lot of the fundamental pieces take care of the gut too. Now, you could still do things that might help support during that time period while you're working on fundamentals, or maybe you need a little extra support than the average person to kind of turn the tide. But you can't cut corners and jump totally to just the microbiome if your diet's crap and your sleep's horrible and you have all these other things that are going to basically create an environment that the microbiome's not going to like, that your body's not going to like from a hormonal balance standpoint. Again, I think it just comes down to, yes, this stuff's so interesting. And I like that you mentioned, okay, we only know 50% of what's going on microbiome wise, and we have to keep that in mind. But like, we do know that nutrition and all these other pieces matter a ton. And we probably are more definitive in the evidence there than kind of like these preliminary studies on estrobolome and things like that kind of make it very zoomed in. Like, this is the problem.
Yeah. Like very, diagnostic, so to speak, very like pathologized. And that's not necessarily the answer here. And, I'll give one example here too. I have an old acquaintance who, she would have told you for years, she struggled with what she said was estrogen dominance. And I think she had a lot of the symptoms, so it made sense that probably was true for her. And she would take, the DIM and the IC3 and the supplements for her estrogen, and it helped her a fair amount. So, there was some reinforcement of this idea in her mind, because she would take the supplements for estrogen dominance and it would help her feel better. And then she'd be like, this was it. But I'll tell you, this particular friend, very, very stressed and not managing her stress very well at all. She had an okay diet, but probably was deficient in at least a couple of things, if I had to take a guess at that. Gut-wise, we talked about gut stuff because she just knew what I did for a living, and I know that there was some gut stuff to maybe work on. But she did a lot of, I don't know if I would call it yo-yo dieting, but she would do a lot of like, oh, we're keto now, and then fall off the wagon, and then we're keto again, and then back off the wagon, and then Weight Watchers, and then off the wagon. And there was a lot of this like cycling on and off of more extreme diets that I saw with her, and sort of disordered eating stuff. And so it's like, all right, what would have been the ultimate answer for her and her hormones? Like, did it make sense for her to just Band-Aid stuff with IC3 or I3C and DIM and like do that sort of stuff? Or would it have made more sense for her to tackle these bigger things? I don't know, but maybe that's a good segue into the supplements. The thing that everybody wants to know, of course.
So one more thing about the yo-yo dieting situation. I think it's really important to point out that if you've been chronically restricting, it's going to be really hard to heal any sort of hormonal issue or balance out your hormones. I think the body, for one, doesn't feel safe when you've been restrictive for a long period of time. And it's something that's so tricky because I think a lot of people don't realize when they've been restrictive how to replenish. And part of that could be cultural too. Like women in general these days are taught to eat cute salads and cute smoothies. And if you're active, we work with, or at least I feel like I work with, I know you do too, active women. And if they haven't necessarily been taught on how to fuel properly, they could have had these hormonal issues for a long period of time and never totally gotten to a point where they're nourished. They might feel like they are, like maybe they were more restrictive in the past and doing like more constructive, intentional dieting. But then for a long time, they've been unintentionally undereating for a while. I just think it's a recipe for hormonal issues, and it's really hard to come out of. And it makes sense too, right? If you're a woman, having a baby is the most metabolically expensive thing that we do. It's wild, y'all. I'm on my second round. So again, it's a wild ride, like making a baby, having a baby, caring for a baby. So your body's not going to want to do that. And it's going to sort of try to divert you from doing that or kind of affect hormones in a way that could affect fertility status if you're not fueled. And that's not the only hormonal thing that happens, but it does make sense that evolutionarily speaking, that there can be some hormonal change when you start to kind of dip metabolically. But yeah, I think, again, all I will say is that if you're having any sort of hormonal issue, you have to be eating enough total. And that has to be almost the first primary goal, because again, it's just the body's just not going to feel safe enough to really pump out hormones in a balanced way and feel like, oh yeah, she's got enough resources and reserves to have a baby. Her body feels safe, so we're going to kind of lower cortisol and that's going to balance things out. It's just like kind of the safety cue that I feel like sometimes, to me, it's an easy way to conceptualize it. Like, oh, my body doesn't necessarily feel safe when I'm in this state. And that's true for gut stuff too. Like if your body chronically doesn't feel safe from nutrition related things, it's going to be hard to break free of gut symptoms too. But we're just talking about hormones. So
I'm glad you brought that up, especially because I think probably most people think about this in the context of an absent period.
Yeah.
You know, like female athlete triad, amenorrhea kind of stuff. But I think you're right. I think that if you have been undernourished or underfueled or on yo-yo diets and your body is getting like these really effed up signals metabolically, you're not going to feel safe enough to have a baby, which does translate to you not feeling safe enough to have good, healthy hormone function. So I think that was a really valid point to bring up. And again, if you're on a restricted diet and you're not eating enough, you're going to be really hard pressed to get enough vitamins and minerals as the double whammy. So is it like the calorie thing or is it the vitamins and minerals thing? I think it's probably both. But again, I would hesitate to believe that you can maintain your current potentially shit diet and just take a multivitamin and be done with it. I don't think that is true for a vast majority of cases.
Well, and to be fair, it's so interesting working with people because sometimes they just don't see stuff clearly either. And again, we all are like that. We all have blind spots. But there's so many people that will say, oh, I'm super active, but I eat enough. And again, it's a scenario too with the fiber. It's like, well, let's see. Especially people that are very active. I'm always like, ooh, your calorie needs are so high. But unless you realize that and you're really on top of things, more than likely you're under. But again, like there can be very normal people with normal activity levels that have just been undereating and have no idea. And they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea I'm 500 calories under every day.
And it's not exclusive to women either. On the off chance that we have any men listening to us right now, I just really recently, maybe a couple weeks ago, we have a new FODMAP Freedom class that started in April. And I just had one of the first Q&As, one of our male students came to the Q&A and he literally asked me, he's like, do you think that the calorie count on Chronometer is do you think that the calculation for calorie need on Chronometer is accurate? And I was like, I mean, yeah, like it's probably good enough for what we're doing here.
Please be inaccurate. Please be inaccurate.
Well, so yeah. So I was like, if anything, it might undershoot your caloric need a little bit. At least that's what Amy has told me her opinion is. And she's a dietitian, so I trust her on that opinion. Why do you ask? And he's like, well, do you think it's reasonable that a man of such and such age might need 2,500 calories a day? And I was like, yeah, totally. Like, and I was like, I'm a woman, but I'm 6 feet tall and like 190 pounds, and Chronometer estimates that I probably need right around 2,000 calories a day. So being a man, yeah, I think that's reasonable. He's like, oh, okay, because I'm only eating half of that.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, it's no wonder. And he's got like brain fog and fatigue, and he's losing weight and he doesn't feel good. And I'm like, oh, bro. Oh God, this is like wild stuff. All right, where do we begin? But under eating is a lot more common than people realize. And even if you're eating enough calories, you would be surprised when you do a little bit of tracking and you do something like Chronometer and you see, oh, I'm chronically undershooting on multiple vitamins and minerals like on a daily basis. I mean, I do. And Amy, I'm making a vow to you right now, oh, dietitian of mine. You ready?
Oh, Lord. Okay, I'm strapped in.
I probably mentioned this months ago. 2024 is the year that I learned how to cook liver. I said this as my New Year's resolution. How many times have I cooked liver so far, Amy? 0 times.
How many times have You're braver than me. I'm a little prissed when it comes to liver too.
Oh, I am too. Well, like, my thing is I haven't found the time to go out to the farm. I identified the farm that I'm going to buy the liver from, by the way.
There's the first step.
Exactly. But I haven't actually gone to the place to get the liver, let alone figured out how to cook it. But I'm telling you, by the end of this year, God damn it, even if I need to do it on New Year's Eve just to do it for the sake of doing it, this is the year that I learned how to cook liver. And it's going to be splendid. And I'm going to get all of these nutrients and it's going to be friggin' phenomenal.
I want to see you Marco Poloing me scrambling on New Year's Eve. Making your liver. I've only tried to make liver a few times and it was like the worst fail.
Don't tell me that.
Again, like it was even the like chicken liver, which is like usually much more mild. It wasn't cow's liver or, so I would love to love liver. I'm going to try. If you, listenership, have a good liver recipe, by all means, if you would link it in the comment section of this YouTube video, that would be splendid. Because honest to God, this is my year to cook liver. I'm going to do it. Mark my words. But my point in sharing that is even Amy and I have some nutritional holes that we could do better with. And I'm very slowly wrapping my head around some nutritional strategies to do that myself. So like the liver thing, for example. But it's important. Right.
I guess that's the point. But briefly, Amy, I did want to mention a couple of supplements. Like I said, it's what they all want. Let's give the people what they want. I mentioned very briefly I3C and DIM.
Right.
So they interconvert. DIM is supposed to be a lot more stable. So DIM tends to be the preferred substance, but basically it's something that this I3C compound is found in cruciferous vegetables, and it's good for estrogen detoxification. The best way that I have heard it described is there are 2 compounds that are found in cruciferous vegetables that are really good for estrogen metabolism. DIM is one, and the other one is sulforaphane, which is the antioxidant found in like broccoli seeds and broccoli stems and sprouts. The best way I heard it said, and I actually looked up my notes for this episode to say this, DIM redirects. So DIM is telling the estrogen, here, go this way. And then sulforaphane actually opens the door. And I thought that was a brilliant way to put it. And I couldn't put it any better myself. So DIM, here, go this way. Sulforaphane opens the door. So that could be a really great combination. A couple of other honorable mentions, N-acetylcysteine, NAC, can help boost glutathione and is pretty rad all the way around, in my opinion. So the idea with estrogen is that there's a bad pathway that's more carcinogenic, and then there are good pathways that you can clear estrogen with. Resveratrol inhibits that bad pathway and again, kind of like redirects the estrogen a bit and sends it down like the methylation or the sulfuration pathways, as opposed to, it's called CYP1B1. So resveratrol is a great antioxidant for many things, but particularly good for hormones. It's also an aromatase inhibitor. So if you're like converting too much of your testosterone into estrogen, it's actually good for that purpose as well. And then I just wanted to mention, honorable mention to bile flow, because all the crap that you detoxify and conjugate and transform in the liver gets put into your bile and then dumped into the gut. So even things like dandelion and artichoke and ginger and these sorts of things that are good bile movers could be really helpful for estrogen.
Yeah, I think those are all. And then we mentioned Maca Harmony. I like Maca Harmony a lot too. The only other one I would one other supplement I might mention, and then I have another point, another thing you could potentially do to help lower estrogens. One, the supplement, again, like, it's not really something that I see often anymore because I don't do as like stool testing really commonly anymore, outside of maybe like a 16S test, but like the beta-glucuronidase marker on those tests, if someone was outright high, like it could be kind of interesting to experiment with calcium D-glucarate. I have a client right now who is estrogen dominant, and she swears by that supplement that it's really helped manage her estrogen dominance while we're working on gut-related things. Like, it helps a lot with her mood. Again, I haven't experimented with it a ton, to be honest, but that's another one to potentially consider. You could play around with. The other point I wanted to make was about like xenoestrogens in some of like the products that you might use. So like cleaning up your skincare, your makeup, your lifestyle a little bit, like products that you use could also help lower some of the estrogen load. Like if you're using a makeup that's really high in xenoestrogens every day, that might be like an easy thing you could swap out too.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And that's like a whole nother can of worms right there.
Right.
So we are going to refrain from getting into this conversation. I forget, we have done some detox episodes and we've talked about like toxicants and stuff. I know one year we did it for our New Year's episode. I think we might have done this again 2 years ago as well. But yeah, detoxification and like getting some of the crap out of your life and out of your home and off of your skin is a really excellent point. Two other things that I'll just throw out there kind of last minute now at the end of the episode. When you mention beta-glucuronidase and calcium D-glucarate, I think, yeah, it's cheap and it can be helpful for people. Another really good way to lower beta-glucuronidase is inulin. And again, it's the premise that inulin gets gobbled up by the microbes and turned into short-chain fatty acids. And those short-chain fatty acids acidify the colon terrain, and then that inhibits the growth of proteobacteria, which would make this enzyme. And I think if I remember correctly, it might also deactivate the enzyme as well. So it's like a twofer shot. But inulin is really, really good at acidifying the colon terrain. So that actually is a great thing for lowering beta-glucuronidase.
It's kind of more of a direct thing too. Like, the calcium D-glucarate is not necessarily solving the problem if you had dysbiosis driving a lot of your estrogen up. The inulin might be a little bit more directly focused at the microbiome too.
Yeah, that's true. One more also, I can't believe I didn't mention this earlier, is especially for symptoms of painful period cramps and breast tenderness, higher dose omega-3 supplement is fantastic for this. And I'm talking like a pretty standard dose for more of like maintenance health purposes for omega-3s might be somewhere around like 1,000 milligrams a day, like a gram a day. But I have been known to super saturate women with omega-3s and pump them up to like 6 or 8 grams per day for maybe a period of like 2 months or so. And that has drastically reduced breast tenderness and cramping. And oftentimes what I'll do with that is I'll pump them up to the absurdly high dose for maybe like 2 months or so and keep them around 8 grams a day, something good like Nordic Naturals. So it's expensive, but it's worth it. So you do that for maybe about 2 months. Then as they start feeling better, then each subsequent cycle, we drop the dose in half. So we'll go from 8 down to 4, down to 2, down to 1. And then we kind of land on that more like normal maintenance dose for omega-3 for them. But that works phenomenally well for that purpose. So
nice.
I wanted to share that here.
Cool. I've never heard that.
Well, Amy, once again, we embarked on this mission telling ourselves before we hit the record button, oh, this will be a short episode. And then once again, we have proved ourselves wrong. We found something to talk about for 59 minutes.
You know, we're not too long.
But anyway, if there's anything you guys know about us at this point, it's that we are incapable of being short-winded. And I hope that that is part of the charm when you come here to the IBS Freedom Podcast. Stay tuned next time where we probably overtalk about yet another topic of interest, but hopefully with some charm and some wit. In the meantime, toodaloo.